Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. We had an amazing 2021, and here in this episode, we try to capture a few of the moments that made it really special. Starting off, we have Jeffrey Archer talking about why he releases his books in India. Jeffrey Archer, as you may all know, is one of the world's leading authors, best-selling authors. And on the podcast, he regaled us with his wit and humor. The whole conversation is really worth a watch. So here's a clip of him talking about why he releases his books in India.
Why does it have to come out in India first? It's because you have someone at London Airport the day it comes out who gets on an aeroplane to somewhere called Mumbai, and 2 days later, this book will be on the streets of Mumbai at a quarter of the price. I recently came into Mumbai and in a motor car, and as you know, if you go from Mumbai airport to Mumbai, you're quite likely to be overtaken not by motorbikes and bicycles, but people walking. And a little boy came up to me and he knocked on the window and he had a pile of paperback books. He knocked on the window, so I wound the window down and he said, "Would you like the latest Jeffrey Archer?" And I said, "I am the latest Jeffrey Archer."
On the podcast last year, we did a lot of episodes on geopolitics. China seemed to feature more than once. So we had Vijay Gokhale, who was the ex-foreign secretary of India, and he's an expert on Chinese politics. He had written a book on the same. So this episode was a deep dive into China and how we can understand better, how we can negotiate with them. So here is Mr. Vijay Gokhale explaining this very complex topic on how China negotiates.
Now, we also, because we are a democratic society, we tend to associate with the way other democratic societies negotiate. And therefore, we need to understand that we are dealing with an entirely different entity here for two reasons. One, this is not a democratic society. And therefore, what the forces that operate in a democratic society and shape policy, parliament, public opinion, non-governmental organizations, and so on, don't work here. The second is, we are the servants of the state. We, as civil servants, follow the constitution. In the case of China, however, the diplomats have a dual responsibility. They are required to be politically aligned, unlike Indian diplomats, which are required to be politically neutral, at least as per the constitution. And therefore, they have to defend the party's interest in addition to the national interest. And therefore, we must not presume that they think with the same logic as we do because of these two important differences. And the two or three important things I really came to was, firstly, that the process of preparing a negotiation is done by them much more carefully than us, particularly agenda setting. It's not just a formality, it's actually the core of the negotiation. That was the first point. The second point was that in the process of negotiation, we should never assume silence to be assent or acquiescence. In the Chinese case, silence invariably means that they disagree, or that they are at the moment not decided in their position, but are waiting to see what you will give up. And this learning process has been quite painful for us because we just assumed that the silence meant that they had agreed to our proposals. So, and there are other examples I give about other ways in which we have misinterpreted the Chinese in the process of that negotiation. Third point, and this I think is critical, is that after a negotiation, the Chinese are interested in perception management. And democracies, again, traditionally don't manage perception in the way the Chinese do, because we are an open book.
Last year, we were also privileged to have Velina Tchakarova, who's a top geopolitical expert, speak about how the new order is emerging. You know, we did multiple episodes with her called Velina's Talk. Do check all of them out. In this particular episode, she spoke about United States along with Ruchir Sharma and how that country has changed, especially after the election of Donald Trump and with Biden coming into power. This was an excellent episode. Do check out this clip.
Most of the societal changes and processes that actually partially led also to Trump's election. So Trump was definitely not the cause, but the symptom of much broader societal processes within the United States, which are perfectly outlined for you and for the viewers and listeners. And I would like to stress that Trumpism as a phenomenon is here to stay. As I said, we are going to further observe the increase of social conflicts within the fabric of the American society. All these dividing lines are going to increase, and of course, on the rather right side of the political spectrum, this kind of tendencies that Trump could reflect so well and could actually capitalize on them in order to become an American president are going to further deepen. So that kind of nationalistic, for instance, tendencies are definitely going to be to increase due to these extremes within the political spectrum. Then, if you think about his America First policy, well, think about, for instance, the whole U.S. Vaccination program following the takeover from Trump to Biden. And you once again will recognize that, for instance, the United States kept very much this kind of approach when it came to vaccinating its own population, while other international actors, let's take India as an example, which donated vaccines to its direct neighbors, or the European Union donated and invested a lot in international vaccination programs, while the United States kept it under America First approach, looking to vaccinate first and foremost its own population.
One of the biggest news stories last year was the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan and the consequent Taliban takeover of the country. And in this episode of Velina's Talk, we interviewed Hizbullah Khan, a journalist in Afghanistan, on what really is happening there. And Hizbullah painted a very vivid picture of the humanitarian situation on the ground after the hostile takeover. This was a heart-wrenching episode. Do check out this clip where Hizbullah talks about what the situation is like in Afghanistan.
Similarly, the third big issue which people are suffering, that is, on one side, the Taliban has captured the whole main highways and roads. The people who worked with the previous administration, the people who played a very active role against the Taliban, against the international terrorists, they are unable to go their home. They are because the tragedy abruptly emerged in Afghanistan. The Taliban captured entire Afghanistan within 10 days, and the people were not prepared for this scenario. Still, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people. They are living in other cities. They even can't meet with their families because the whole main highway is captured by the Taliban, and the people can't go their home, their villages and their markets by road because they feel that the Taliban would capture them and would kill them after capturing. On the other side, the whole airport system and flights are still closed. They can't go other cities by flights as well. Similarly, the fourth very big issue, that is the whole hospitals are still closed. Many doctors have already left Afghanistan, and those doctors that are still living in Afghanistan, they feel fear. They are unable to continue their jobs, and they are not going to attend their duties. On the other side, the people and the patients, they are coming to hospitals, but there are no doctors in the hospital. This is also a very big issue in Afghanistan. And the fifth very big issue which is underway, that is unprecedented brain drain of human history, is underway. Highly educated people, including doctors, professors, lecturers, historians, poets, writers, political scientists, psychologists, they are leaving Afghanistan. These are the people who came to Afghanistan from the European countries, and they were working for the reconstructions of Afghanistan, and they were working on the key posts in Afghanistan. But no, tens of thousands of intelligentsia are leaving Afghanistan. That is very, very big issue for Afghanistan, and the Taliban is also pressurizing these highly educated people to flee Afghanistan because they want that they should not face any civil society resistance in the future while imposing draconian and barbarian laws in Afghanistan. And similarly, 1.5 million people were working with the previous administrations. And similarly, there are some more of professions like the journalists who work with the international media, women rights activists, political activists, and politicians. They are receiving death threats. They are keeping from one place to other places. Every day they are changing their places. The Taliban are giving threats to them.
Sanjeev Sanyal is the principal economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. We were really privileged to host him on the podcast. In this short 30-minute episode, he spoke about the big picture outlook and the future of the Indian economy. In this particular clip that you're going to see, he talks about our recovery post the second wave of COVID.
Now we have gone through a second wave. So there are other things that are different this time as well. First of all, we can't be sure that the middle class will come back and spend again in the same way they did after the first lockdown. For the simplest reason, the first round, the middle class kind of saw it as a forced holiday. You will remember, people were posting photographs of their cooking, their Delgano coffee, and all that kind of thing. I think the second round has been much more closer to home. People have lost near and dear ones. Even those who have not been personally affected will certainly know somebody who has been personally affected. So in that sense, the mood is much more somber, and it's difficult to tell psychologically what the impact of that will be. There will be an opening up and people will come back to some extent, but to what extent that pent-up demand will follow through, needs to be watched. You can't predict it. We need to watch this, and there's something we have to be concerned about. Secondly, there is the issue of inflation. Now, prices did spike up the last time as well because of supply side disruptions. But if you remember what I was saying at that time, we were not concerned about inflation substantially last time because it's quite obvious that demand was not, was not the problem. They had caused a temporary supply side breakdown. That supply side was opened up and inflation did indeed come down. Now what you have is a more complicated picture because, first of all, there is inflation globally coming back. So that is something we need to take into account. Energy prices have spiked up very significantly. So unlike in the first phase where oil prices crashed, here oil prices have actually gone up. And of course, there is the repeated breakdowns of various things that have happened, and we need to see what has happened to the supply side. Is this a permanent scarring of various bits and pieces of the supply side, or is it the case that once we open up, it will all go back? So for the first time in many, many years, worldwide, we need to watch inflation. I'm not saying that this is going to go into a spiral just yet. It may well be that it'll all kind of ease things up, and maybe Iran oil coming back on stream, etc., will temper things. So I'm not sort of beginning to press the red button yet. But I do think that unlike the first time where I was completely sanguine about the inflation situation, I will, in this round, watch it quite carefully.
2021 was a huge year for startups in India. I think you could say it's a watershed year. Many companies went public and a ton of money coming into the ecosystem. Here is Nimish Joshi, who is a senior startup leader, speaking about the IPO boom and what it really means for the ecosystem.
See, firstly, very importantly, the liquidity conditions have been fairly benign globally. And you would have seen this filing for IPOs hasn't been an India-specific phenomenon, though I must admit the pace of filing has gone up significantly in India. It is you've seen that in the US, seen that the Chinese IPO as well. And in general, there has been a fairly buoyant primary market environment. So most importantly, I would say the benign liquidity conditions, definitely a lot of money being pumped in, and it has to flow through somewhere. And what's happening is that money is meeting potential opportunity, and opportunity is in two sense. One, of course, globally, everything is being digitized. All our habits have changed. People have moving more and more online. So there's definitely a feeling that if you were to take a 5-10 year future, the expectation of all investors is maybe at least some of these companies will become very big. And there have been instances, people have seen, right, example of Amazon. And when things really go up, Amazon, Google, Facebook, these companies can acquire tremendous size and scale, which we can't imagine sitting here. So that excess capital is flowing through in a basket of a lot of these companies, which happen to be new age digital companies globally. So I would say these are the two broad trends. Now, in that trend, the third thing that has happened is Indian companies, and I must applaud Zomato for taking that call 1 year back when things didn't seem as buoyant as they are today, to really go ahead for the IPO.
Rajeev Mantri is the founder of Navam Capital, and we hosted him on multiple episodes last year. Here in this clip, he speaks about the Indian startup ecosystem and the IPO boom as well, and how all of this has come to the fore after the global supply chains have reconfigured post-COVID.
No, certainly, I think in some ways, a high-profile IPO like that of Zomato kind of has opened the floodgates. I think a lot of people who were skeptical of whether India can support like large cap, consumer tech companies in the public space, they have sort of certainly probably reassessing their views or maybe change their minds. And when it comes to valuations, so obviously Zomato saw a significant pop on listing. I think the stock had nearly doubled, if I remember correctly, on listing from what the IPO issue price was. So one could always argue for and against, that is richly valued, versus some people would continue to say that it has a lot of headroom for growth and so on. But I think the larger takeaway here is that India is clearly a very good destination for listing of such companies, and there is no reason that consumer companies should actually solely focus on the US path. I can see why it makes sense for several types of like deep tech companies or SaaS companies, but in a way, if you're a consumer company, if you're a well-known brand, if your customers are in India, if your business is largely in India, then it may make sense to list in India too. And I think overall it's a great development because it creates just one more option, right? Like if you're looking at the listing path, then you have the India option to take as well.
In the first half of last year, we also had Harsh Gupta, who is an economist and an investor, talk about a recovery from the second wave and what that will look like. Harsh is famous for coining Modinomics, where he speaks about 4 or 5 different axes of growth that Prime Minister Modi has pioneered and his policies. In this episode, we looked back at all of those 5 pillars and how that has changed in the wake of COVID. In this clip, he speaks about the economic impact of COVID and what the future holds for us.
So I basically did a simple thought experiment. And by the way, everybody's flying in the dark right now because such a quote unquote natural experiment has never happened in human economic history. The closest we got to was World War II, in a sense that there was massive damage and the economies of Japan and Germany kind of rebounded very strongly, saying that, there are 2 aspects of growth. One is incremental over and above last year. The other is kind of zero based, right? which is factor based. Okay, no matter what happened in last year, this is the labor we have, this is skills we have, this is the factories we have, this is the real estate and infra we have. If we all put them together, how will they produce output, right? So one is a factor-based, zero-based growth. One is incremental or kind of path-dependent growth. And both actually are very important in economic growth for the next coming time period. In most cases, for all of human history, most of human history, it's very difficult to disentangle the two because, even when we had very tragic incidents, we were not either prosperous or humane enough as a human civilization or technologically advanced enough to even contemplate lockdowns, right? Lockdowns is the very fact that lockdowns happen, whether we are for it or against it, is actually a testament to humanity in many ways, because it says that actually we can do some fiscal monetary policy, give you some welfare, we can work on the healthcare and the vaccines part. Could you please for a few weeks or months stay at home if possible? I mean, of course, in Western countries, it's easier with white collar workers. In India, that ratio is lower. We have more blue collar workers. So there is a difference. But the very fact that we are contemplating that is actually, in a strange way, a massive compliment to humanity. So I think it now depends whether next year's India's growth or any country's growth, do we take the base of last year and then add some percentage plus or minus to growth through estimate growth? Or do we start with the base of 2019 instead of 2020 and saying, well, the factors of production are either stable or they've broadly increased by so much, be it infrastructure, be it human demographics or skills or literacy, education experience, or be it factories, right? Maybe new factory capacity was not added because, of existing capacity was not utilized. So I think it's a bit of both. And I think the zero-based concept of growth, kind of factor-based and not just path-dependent, zero-based is underestimated in current estimates.
One of my favorite episodes of 2021 was the couple of episodes we did with Ruchir Sharma and Vishal Ganeshan, where we spoke about the foreign press's coverage of India and in particular Prime Minister Modi. Now, all of us are often wondering, why this is the case, but Ruchir and Vishal explained, the historical significance of this and how it's been pretty much a constant for a couple of 100 years at least. So here is Ruchir speaking about some of the cultural changes in 2021 and why the foreign media behaves the way it does.
There is this personal animosity towards Modi as an individual and as a politician. But if we were looking into the broader historical context, let's look at all of the prime ministers we've had since independence. So first we had Nehru. He was despised in the Western media. They really hated him. If there was one international leader who was, treated with complete revulsion among Western media, it was Nehru. And in particular, his diplomats at the UN, there were cartoons in the New York Times showing them like snakes. That, these are venomous vipers who talk about, the third world, who talk about non-alignment, but, we know they're all Soviet stooges. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union hated him as well, saying that, this guy is just a bourgeois imperialist. He didn't even get India real freedom. He gave them fake independence and built this, Brown Sahib state which kept colonial police, colonial judiciary, colonial bureaucracy, and now just pretends to be kinder while having the same sadistic tools of imperialism. So, he was quite disliked on the international level. And then that was followed by Lal Bahadur Shastri, who, was seen as, this, leader of this poor country. There's such a famine going on there and they're at war. And, such a sad fate for a country that got independence, less than 2 decades ago. So it was very negative and patronizing. That was followed by Indira Gandhi, who, the US foreign policy establishment and the media, were very hostile to. They, did not take kindly to her actions, even when humanitarian. For example, the liberation of Bangladesh, the ending of the Pakistani army's genocide of Bengalis was not seen as a humanitarian achievement in the Western media. And consistently, no matter whether an Indian prime minister is left wing or right wing, no matter what their actual policies are, India is not seen as a country that has shared interests or values with the core of the West. So the core of the West is the US and its client states. So NATO, Australia, New Zealand, and then its second rung of client states like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia.
One of those things that made primetime news for most of the year in 2021 was the farm laws. And in this clip, we have Anand Ranganathan, television personality, very outspoken person, and scientist, no less, make an appearance on Bharatvaarta, accompanied by a panel of guests from our good friends at CFOC, the Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth. And here he is speaking about the justification for the farm laws and their potential impact on the agricultural sector.
Basically, there are like three reforms. They have been promulgated into laws. One is concerning the APMCs, Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees, through which some of the or most of the agricultural produce used to go, used to be sold. So the government was an arbiter, and the middlemen used to make huge amounts of profit. So a farmer who's producing something just could not sell it to anyone. He had to go through these markets. Now, what the Congress and the opposition wanted before these reforms was to do away with these markets, do away with these APMC. This bill or these reforms do not do that. They just provide the farmer with a choice. You can either go through the mandis, so-called mandis, or you can sell it without going through these mandis. So it's not, it's even a little bit lower than what the opposition wanted. They wanted to do away with these APMCs, and there are many states that don't have these APMCs. In fact, for a lot of crops, these APMCs do not exist. In a lot of states, the APMCs do not exist, leave alone for some crops or few crops. So that's the first law. The second law was concerning the Essential Commodities Act. Now, this is a relic from the 50s and the 60s. What the government could do was at any time it could declare that you cannot hoard, you cannot store any agricultural produce because it was dictating the price of it. And as a result, what would happen was that, farmers, including a lot of go-down owners or private players, would not store the produce because at any time the government could come and actually confiscate it or, put a lock on your go-down. So you could only produce something that you could sell almost immediately, or not. You were not in a position to store something and to be able to sell it in refrigerated godowns after, let's say, 6 months, 7 months. So the farmers were captive to this. Now what has happened is, barring one or two emergency clauses, you could actually, the private players could come in. You would be able to create or make massive godowns, and the farmers could produce their crops all year round with the safe knowledge that the government would not prosecute or jail godown owners, and the godown owners would simply buy, or the farmers could lease out the godowns and store their produce. So this is a fantastic step. This is what all logical, rational people should do. The third reform was, of course, contract farming. That is that you would not lease your land, of course, but you could actually enter into a contract with a private player, and the private player could tell that, look, I'm, this crop, you sell it to me through contract farming on your farm. Now, the first two reforms were wanted by all the opposition, and that was put in their manifestos. The third reform was already being enacted in Congress-ruled states, for last 7-8 years. For example, Punjab already had passed a contract farming law back in 2013, and Captain Amrinder Singh had been following it. So that's the tragedy, that these reforms do not go to the lengths that even what the opposition and the Kisan unions, or the 9 prominent Kisan unions, you mentioned TICAT's union, BKU, but there are a lot of other unions that also wanted these reforms. And these very 3 reforms are the ones that are now being opposed by these people.
We were privileged to host Shri Jayant Sinha ji, the former Minister of State for Finance and the current Minister of State for Civil Aviation. He had earlier submitted a private member's bill to the parliament to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. And in this episode, he spoke about sustainability. And here in this particular clip, he talks about how it's really not a trade-off between being competitive and being sustainable, and how both are possible.
No, I completely agree. And I think the Honorable Prime Minister is exactly right to talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat. And my equation is that A and B equals CSR, right? A and B equals CSR. Atmanirbhar Bharat equals a competitive Bharat on the green frontier, a sustainable Bharat on the green frontier, and a resilient Bharat on the green frontier, so that our health outcomes are also improved and we can invest and build up a healthy economy as well. So that's why I think, for us to pursue Atmanirbharta, competitiveness is key, sustainability is key, and those are the things that we can really strive for when we get to the green frontier. And please remember that these green technologies actually create far more jobs than the brown technologies do, right? There are many more people involved in doing solar than they are in running a thermal power plant. We have to build an entirely new infrastructure for electric charging. That's going to use a lot of people, right? So all of that, the investment that's going to flow into green our economy is going to create jobs. And by the way, one of the things I've been doing is, because my intuition has always been that if you pour hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into the Indian economy, it's bound to grow. I mean, that's just pure, simple economic logic, right? But what I have also now started to do is to work with a series of modeling groups, some of the best systems dynamics and econometric modelers in the world. And I have asked them to actually do these very deep analytical studies to see whether my intuition is right, whether net zero is actually pro-growth or not. And guess what? The early results coming back from these modeling studies is that relative to a baseline, net zero is net positive. Net zero is net positive. And the conventional view is that net zero is net negative, because if you don't give us cheap fossil fuels, we will not be able to grow quickly. But we know that that's a fallacy.
One of the most heated debates in recent times is cryptocurrency and how governments should view it. In this episode, we had Rameesh Kailasam, who is the CEO of India Tech, and also Akshay Bedi, who's a startup evangelist and an active crypto investor, talk about both the policy and the technology side of things. It was a fascinating episode, plenty of nuances that we covered on cryptocurrencies. Here in this clip, Ramesh talks about how government could potentially regulate cryptocurrency.
So when suddenly something disruptive happens, the first rush of blood that happens for a regulator is to say, oh, this has a potential to bypass a lot of things which I have put in place and a lot of things that I have ring-fenced and kept. So what do I do that? I mean, how do I handle this scenario is very simple. I retrofit these guys into the conventional laws that I have written. So therefore, the obvious choice for many people is to say, okay, I mean, you might be a cab hailing app. I mean, I'm going back to Akshay's example, but so what? I mean, it's still transport, it's still taxi. So you're governed by the rules which will apply to a taxi operator. I mean, that's the first immediate reaction that would happen because that is convenient. And to the crypto world, it acts as the same. But unfortunately, that kind of thinking would have helped crypto had regulators taken that stand. But where it comes is because it called itself a currency, people fell for less of crypto and more for currency. The currency word started dominating people's vocabulary and mindset, and people started looking at it and started saying, hey, if it is a currency, then I have a problem because I own the currency. I issue the currency in my country. Who is this guy? I know if it is a dollar which is coming from US, I know if it is a pound coming from UK, or any of the currencies you pick up which has an identified sovereign nation backing it. But who backs this? Nobody. So which means that, does it mean that the people around the world will now have their own currencies and we'll be left high and dry? And will it lead to chaos? Will it lead to anarchy? Will it lead to possible misuse? And they are right in thinking on their own terms, being paranoid about it. But I guess the question therefore comes in is it a currency, or has it matured enough or qualified to be called a currency? And if there are use cases which are building up, no doubt. I mean, all of us can keep talking about multiple use cases, and I'm sure Akshay will give you more such examples. But the point is for the regulator, since they are viewing it as a currency and this industry initially positioned it and called it a currency, there is a perceived amount of mistrust that exists with the regulators simply to say, okay, I can't allow another currency to operate, which is why when we wrote the white paper, our thing was very simple. Tell the regulator, if I go to the regulator tomorrow and say, hey, this is a great currency, you need to adopt it because it has multiple uses. He said, sorry, I have my own currency. I might issue something similar if that is what fills your appetite for being digital, but I will not take this. So I think the alternative narrative which we pushed down, which was to say, okay, let's not give it or accord it the status of a currency for now.
Becoming self-sufficient and Atmanirbhar is one of the emerging themes post-2020. And in this episode, we have the one and only Mr. Sridhar Vembu, CEO of Zoho and Padma Shri awardee, speak about how we can develop our indigenous capabilities and truly become Atmanirbhar.
First, actually, this government now, private sector is seen now as a asset partners in development. That's important. You have to remember that in the past, India has not seen private sector that way. And it's refreshing to see this. Actually, I go to Delhi and from government officials, ministers, everyone, there is a lot of respect for the private sector and as partners in development. That's an important mindset. Because we all, I actually personally believe I should work in the private sector, but for the public good and the country's good. Now, everyone shouldn't have to be in public life in order to be serving the public good. So that's an important notion that we have to internalize. And that has been changing in the last 10-15 years in India, definitely, and that's a good thing. And we have to still bring down certain items of the past mindset of red tape that arise from distrust. Those things will go away. They are going away, okay, over time. We are becoming a very business-friendly nation, and the private sector also has to respond in kind with proactive initiatives in talent building, skill building, rural development initiatives, all of that. So it has to be a two-way street, and that is happening. And for these technologies, for the research and development, we have institutions like IITs and IIScs, and those things now have entrepreneurship cells. I know IIT Madras has a very active thing going on there. Similarly, IIT Bombay and other institutions have that too. And all of these have to be nurtured. The technologies have to be transferred. As I mentioned, one possibility would be these open source technologies that smaller entrepreneurs from small towns can use. That has great potential too. So these are the things I believe could make a difference in terms of creating employment, creating the skills and know-how in India. It's possible, but see, these things, we first need platforms. We don't have very many platform companies in India. So we need these platforms before we get there. And I'm optimistic over the next 10-15 years, these things will emerge. And so that is and then the government can give it a push by mandating certain things to be made here or locally controllable, all of that. For example, every country is now passing data sovereignty laws. Local database has to be kept here. They have to obey Indian law. That type of thing, law is useful. And similar, I think laws, all that could be helpful. So this is where I think in our country has to be bold and insist that technology be available, made available here, technology be transferred, and all of that has to be clearly part of the commitment these companies make here.
Right. Last year, Ashish hosted Shailesh Pathak, the head of special initiatives and development projects at L&T. Mr. Pathak spoke about infrastructure, growth, and various nuances associated with it. He's had a rich career and has an insider's perspective on some of these things. In this particular clip, he talks about some of the global best practices that India can adopt.
If you look at the project life cycle of infrastructure projects, there is essentially a design phase in which we decide what to do. And that is decided usually by the government, right?
Right.
Once it is decided, the design phase comes up with specific blueprints and drawings and detailed project reports. Then the search for financing happens, because without money, you're not going to build it. And once the design is ready and the financing happens, then the bids are invited for construction. So the procurement cycle happens. Once the Successful bidder has been given the letter of intent and the notice to proceed. Actual construction happens.
Right.
And of course, after construction, the operations phase happens. So typically, I always keep this with me to remind ourselves that the man wearing these safety jackets is the man constructing our infrastructure and operating our infrastructure. So activities wearing this are fairly predictable. So making a metro in Pune and in Paris or in Shanghai are pretty much the same activity. But it is the pre-construction activities before wearing this jacket that take too long in India.
Right.
And then you have, I'll start with the story here. One of my good friends was in the Embassy of India in Japan, in Tokyo. And we had a new building to be built for the Indian embassy in Tokyo. And it was awarded after whatever process. And the time given was some 2 years and 6 months. So that's, 24, 30 months. At the end of the 20th month, not one thing had happened on the site. And, we in India, if for 20 months nothing happens on site, we'll hit panic buttons. And our colleagues reached out to the construction contractor. They said, we are designing, we are planning to the last detail how we are going to build this. And you don't worry, you'll get it in 30 months. So sometime around the 22nd month, they started construction. In the 29th month, they handed over the building fully completed. So, what we do typically is we do some Bhumi Puja. We put foundation stone in the second month, and then for 7 months, nothing happens. And then suddenly some flurry of activity. So maybe this is a way to design our programs better and design our construction schedules better.
Again, one of my personal favorites of 2021 was getting an opportunity to speak to Shri Rajiv Malhotra ji, who is an academic and an author. We spoke about his latest book, AI and the Future of Power, and how AI will determine the geopolitical order. This was a fascinating conversation. In this particular clip, he talks about the impact of AI and how it can cause a cultural change.
Artificial intelligence is a major disruptor, like the Industrial Revolution, in England and then in other European countries, disrupted the way manufacturing is done, disrupted world economics. Many industries died. The labor-intensive previous industries died. They could not keep up with it. And new industries were born, new job categories were born that did not exist. And it also disrupted the relationship between who are the winners and losers. Some of the people who are doing very well, their whole industry or profession was finished, and some completely new kind of people emerged. It also changed the relationship between countries. Britain became a big power and India became a colony. So when people tell you that the Industrial Revolution was great and so will the AI revolution be great, you got to tell them it was great for some people, but not for other people. In fact, the colonization of the world, not just India, but colonization of large parts of the world and European countries becoming colonizers is related to the Industrial Revolution. Every historian will tell you that. The rise of Europe is related to the Industrial Revolution. So will this new AI revolution be the rise of China, for instance, because they are ahead in AI? Will, just like Britain and France fought wars with each other and also fought over colonies, who gets which colony? In India, British soldiers and French soldiers and Dutch soldiers fighting each other for colonial control. So in the same way, will US and China be fighting with each other and also fighting over colonies? Are they rival colonizers? Is that a way to look at the world? And not just these two, but a few others also. So, and where is India in all this? What will happen to India? Are we going to become another colony once more because in the AI we lost the race? Or are we able to move up fast enough? Too much AI creates unemployment, especially if it's very haphazard. It'll make the rich richer, but a large number of poor people will become poorer. Maybe the bottom 500 million people in India are vulnerable because they're not well educated. It's difficult to upscale them. You can say we'll upscale people to AI, but somebody is a taxi driver or a street vendor or barber. I mean, how are you going to upscale him to AI? It's not that easy. How about farmers, poor people in villages? How do you upscale them into the AI economy? Not that easy. It's easier said than done. And a lot of our people are talking like this because they're parroting what's written about AI in the Western countries. And so they're assuming they can just quote it and apply it to India. But that's not so easy.
We were privileged to host Amish Tripathi ji again. Amish is, of course, India's best-selling author. In this episode, he appeared along with Bhavna Roy ji, who is his sister. And we spoke about their new book, Dharma, which decodes our ancient Indian epics and explores the meaning of life from an Indian philosophical perspective. Here in this clip, he speaks about individuality versus collectivism, which is, of course, an important part of our existence today. Here he is talking about what he calls the beehive mentality.
I think Didi had said this beautifully, that when we were discussing this philosophy, that often we have to be clear what beehive are we a part of. Right? And that defines how we react often. Often those who speak of pure individual rights at the cost of everything else are actually part of the beehive called globalists, right? Which is actually a separate culture. This is a separate global culture, may not necessarily be connected to the nation that they are living in. They may not be rooted. If I look at myself, what is the beehive I'm a part of? I'm a part of my family, right? That is the beehive that I'm a part of. I'm a part of the beehive of Lord Shiva worshippers. Right? I'm a part of the beehive of the Sanatanis, the Dharmic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. I'm a part of this beehive. I'm a part of the beehive of Mother India. So everyone, regardless of the religion they follow, regardless of their background, regardless of the language, is my beehive, part of my beehive. And yes, hopefully, sometime all of us will reach the spiritual wisdom to see all human beings as a part of one beehive. Perhaps we are far away from that. I can't say I follow that right now, but maybe I'm sure we'll reach that stage also sometime. Then when we realize that that is what enlightened selfish interest should lead to, right? Because you will do what is in the interest of your beehive, but you'll also realize that while doing that, usually if you hurt yourself, if you're not going in your own interests, then you hurt the beehive as well. You have to remain strong to be able of being being of use to the beehive. So essentially what I'm suggesting is there's a balance, right? If it swings to either extreme, and one of the things that comes with dharma is the value of balance. If it swings on either extreme, where you're so individualistic that you don't care at all about what happens to the beehive, which is happening in many Western countries, right? That is not good. It leads to loneliness, destruction of the community, destruction of traditions. And we're seeing the fallout of that during the COVID pandemic. These societies have become weak and brittle. They don't know how to handle, a crisis, a society-wide crisis like this, because they're all alone, right? Unlike in India, where you're never alone, right? There's a downside to that as well. Your neighbors will interfere in your life. Everyone will. There's no privacy. First time you meet someone, they'll say, "Bacche nahi hai, kyun nahi hai?" Arey yaar, tere ko kya lena dena hai? Okay, but there is an upside to that as well, that you are not alone. Someone will always be there to help you, to look out for you. That gives the society strength. It makes it anti-fragile. It's one of the reasons I think India has done so well in the COVID pandemic, because we are not just dependent on the government. We help each other. We have traditions. We have community, right? So if you go too individualistic, that is not good. But if you go too much on the beehive and don't look at yourself at all, that is not good either, because then you surrender liberalism. And there are societies like that. You surrender women's rights. You surrender LGBT rights. It becomes hidebound. That's not good either. You have to find that balance, right? That is what makes it ideal. But every action that you do, the the phrase that I would use is enlightened selfish interest, that it should be in my interest, but it should be in the interest of my beehive as well. If I'm writing, for example, a book which could say get me an award or get me more sales internationally, but is not in the interest of India, should I do it? I'm very clear, no, India is my beehive. No, I will not do it, right? But should I, not try and, build my own career? No, how does that help unless I am of use to my country? And for that, I have to have my own strength as well. So again, balance.
We hosted Mr. Anand Ranganathan a couple of times last year, and on his first appearance on Bharatvaarta, we had a freewheeling conversation on a wide range of topics, from the nature of political debate in India to criticism of the government and, of course, some of the protests that were happening. Here he is talking about freedom of speech and how that is being twisted by social media.
When you shout fire in a theater, you do it with the knowledge that you're going to harm many lives, So it is actually literally turning into, as they say, that what is it that your right to punch, I can't remember, is not, it's only until it kind extends, of your right extends to till my nose is not punched or something. So in that case, it is quite literal, because you have the foreknowledge that if I shout fire, when there is no fire, I'm going to lead to, a kind of a bugdar, and people are going to die or maybe suffocate to death, which is what happens when you do that. So, then you are certainly culpable. But other than that, I think when you delve into an area of gray, that is who is to decide. And that is what the tragedy of our country is, because one fine day, somebody can get up and say, look, according to me, you have offended the religious or other sensibility, and I'm going to prosecute you. But it is dependent upon you. You are making that decision. There is no hard and fast rule. There can never be that, what offends others, what doesn't. And of course, this law, Section 295A, actually came about through, as you would know, there was this book that was published, Rangila Rasool. Now, that book led to the assassination of the publisher. And people celebrated the assassin, right from Allama Iqbal to Jinnah, who fought for him in the court, to lakhs of people who turned out at his funeral. But in fact, not many people know this, that Mahatma Gandhi was against the publication of that book, but Ambedkar stood for the publication of that book. And that publication of Rangila Rasool was, as a kind of a defense mechanism, was a rebuttal to a Muslim publication that called Goddess Sita as a prostitute. So this was a reaction to that, and there was no law. There was no law to prosecute the publisher. And Gandhi, in fact, after Gandhi kind of ranted against Rangila Rasool and said, "I wish something could be done." This thing, Britishers brought this law. So on one hand, you have Ambedkar who's standing for it. On the other hand, you have Gandhi who's against it. You can't just stick to one view. So this kind of delving into the gray, into what constitutes decency, what constitutes morality, these are all gray areas. I'd much rather not have it. Give the freedom to everyone to say what they want to say, because, let me not be the arbiter to decide that this is wrong and this is right. I should never do.
Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji was one of the most significant prime ministers India has ever had. And in this special episode, we had the privilege of speaking with the late author Shakti Sinha ji, who had written a book, Vajpayee, The Years That Changed India. Shakti Sinha ji, of course, had a very close relationship with the former prime minister since he was an aide during his time in the office. And here Shakti ji talks about...
Suddenly, the figure of Vajpayee, that period of his rule, was being romanticized in a manner which to me was jarring. If I remember those days, they were very difficult days. The language used against Mr. Vajpayee and his government by his opponents, not just political opponents, but ideological opponents in the media, in academia, was extremely harsh, brutal, anti-minority, fascism, saffronization, you name it, the words were being bandied about in those days. And now you write that, oh, he was such a great man, 25, you all loved him. Well, if you loved him, where were you those days? I didn't see you anywhere. And I've quoted in the back the same people to today you realize him. I've just quoted what they wrote in different media then. So I thought the need, one was that need. Second, as a student of history, I found it amazing that in some ways we don't too much care about recent contemporary history, right? Well, the fact of the matter is India is a young country. It's a country which is changing very fast, changing substantially. You know, growing up in the 60s, between the 60s and 1998, the changes were incremental, snail's pace, glacial. 98 to now, if I see now as an example, completely new India, for the good, for the better. Yes, we have our warts, we have our chaos, but compared to what I saw earlier India, I think need to portray the picture is important. Why do I call the years that changed India? I've listed 5 things in the book coherently, which tries to explain how those 5 specific steps. 1, the first genuine non-Congress government in Indian history, genuinely non-Congress government. It had 1 or 2 people who had worked in the Congress, that is it. Unlike the Janata Party or Chandrasekhar or VP Singh, who were lifelong congressmen, this was not a Congress government. And it faced a lot of opposition, tremendous amount, which I just mentioned. 2, crossing the nuclear threshold, which should have been done much long ago, it was done. 3rd, reaching out to Pakistan then, first to demonstrate this hyphenation is bad, India-Pak. 2nd, you can't be a great power if your own neighborhood is unsettled and you try to settle your neighborhood in different ways. Whether it's surgical strikes or through peace, some way you have to settle your neighborhood. So the outreach to Pakistan culminating in Lahore, very important. 3rd, completely changing Indian thinking about the world by saying that USA and India are natural allies. Ally is a word even today people share. No, partners, okay. How can you say ally? Ally does not mean subordination. Ally meant partners who have convergence of interest, convergence of values, and who in the changing world must work with each other. And the lastly was our ability in the Kargil war to conduct it as a responsible nuclear weapon state, but without compromising our security, and our ability for the first time to convince the world that it is the Pakistan which is the aggressor. Don't apply the same standards to both of us. Get them out first, then we talk. So I think these are the 5 things I think happened, which really have changed the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at the world, and critically the way the world looks at us.
Our resident history buff, Vivek Khaitan, is known for his in-depth analysis and retellings of significant occurrences in the history of our country. And in this clip, he speaks about a what-if scenario, a counterfactual in which Subhash Chandra Bose had returned to India. It's a very interesting clip. Do check it out.
So I will look at, some of the events, especially between 1945 and 47, and see what kind of impact Netaji, would have had if he would have come back alive. And the only way I see him coming back alive was that if he would have been captured and brought back to India for a trial as a war criminal by British government, right? If he would have come back, he would have received a hero's welcome in India. The reason why British decided to leave was the string of small mutinies which happened between 1945 and 46 in various parts of India and Indian Army, and a big naval mutiny which happened in Bombay in 1946. I think the intensity and the spread of those mutinies would have been even bigger if Netaji would have come, and he would have been seen as the liberator of India. Netaji's popularity in 1938-39 itself, and particularly in 1940s, was rivaling Gandhi. By 1945-46, he would have eclipsed popularity of Gandhiji. And I think he would have been able to completely command Congress Party, which was the only national organization of consequence at that point, right? And he would have been able to sideline all the other leaders who would have not been, in favor of seeing Netaji as their leader. So he would have commanded the unprecedented kind of following at that point, and so that's one part. The second part is what would have happened to the partition at that point, right? I think like Nehru, he too had as much blinkers as far as Muslim polity of the time is concerned, and he would have been as helpless as as Nehru was or Gandhiji was as far as the partition question is concerned. Even though he had a certain spiritual side, he was not doctrinaire, like Nehru, but he believed in Hindu-Muslim unity, and unlike some of the other leaders like Savarkar, he was not exposed to the to the seamier side of Muslim polity, right? And he was unaware of it in a sense. So I think he would have been as bewildered, as taken in by surprise at the turn of events. But I think administratively, perhaps he would have managed it much better than Nehru did. He would have insisted on some sort of guarantee from Pakistan in order to safeguard their minorities, much better guarantees than what Nehru could get from Liaquat Ali Khan, right? So that's what I think. 1947, he would have easily become the Prime Minister of India if he wanted. He would have been the first Prime Minister of India, I have no doubt about that. His popularity would have been at a scale where Gandhi would not have been able to overrule, public opinion of that scale, right? When Gandhi overruled Patel, he was overruling basically the decision of the Congress party. He was not overruling public opinion. For all his greatness, Patel was not a mass leader in the sense that Nehru was, and Nehru easily would have won a public contest against Patel, but he wouldn't have won that against Bose. Even Gandhi wouldn't have been able to prevent from that.
Last year, we remembered the contributions of Goa's most significant chief minister and also former defense minister, Shri Manohar Parrikar ji, who sadly passed away quite recently. Here is Vijay Gokhale, a national security analyst and a close personal friend of Mr. Parrikar, speaking about the former chief minister and defense minister's very informal style of working.
I think his own personality from the childhood, from whatever one could gather from his sister, his friends, childhood friends, and the family, he was always of a different bent of mind. That he always thought of solutions rather than lamenting about problems. So there are these anecdotes which are there in the book, which have some of them, of course, have been written about by his friends in IIT Bombay. How he solved a strike of the mess cooks or the workers in the mess by not succumbing to their demands and getting his fellow classmates to start cooking and buying vegetables themselves and that kind of thing. I think he had a early bent of mind very early in his life about problem solving, and with education and with the kind of training he got in IIT Bombay and the early life that he led as an entrepreneur made him always look for solutions, and which he applied. That template he applied even as defense minister. I mean, I know of meetings that lasted more than 7-8 hours, sometimes 12 hours, to get a complicated issue resolved by taking everybody on board. I mean, he was willing to listen to a contrarian point of view. He was willing to call people directly if they had skill and expertise. So I have seen senior and middle-level officers in the chain being called individually to meet him to understand the problem. He was not afraid to pick up the phone and call officers or bureaucrats directly. He didn't go through the switchboard or the exchange. He would rather call people directly and get their insights. I know of somebody who spent 3.5 or 4 hours with him talking about the mess in the defense ministry very early in his tenure, apart from me, which I discovered only recently, and then implementing some of those suggestions and recommendations given by that person. So, he had that kind of, he had no ego. He didn't say that I had all the solutions. He was willing to take a lot of people on board, take them along and get their inputs to finally arrive at his own decision, of course. But that was his style, that he would read through each and every file. He'll remember the page number in which certain decisions were described or taken, and then catch people on those lines if they tried to sort of shoot their way out of the trouble. by saying, I don't know, I'll have to study the file and all that. He used to tell them that I know that this is the file, this is the page number, this is the paragraph in which the solution has been described. So he had that very sharp memory and ability to listen and then, of course, come to his own conclusion.
One of our most inspiring episodes of the last year was our conversation with Mr. Shridhar Venkat, CEO of the Akshay Patra Foundation. In this episode, he told us about the different projects that the organization has undertaken to educate children and encourage them to follow their dreams. This was a very inspiring episode, and here he is talking about teaching kids on how to build robots.
I'll give you one example, Roshan. Okay, so then you can understand what keeps us, so motivated and inspired. This was pre-COVID time. I was in my office, so I heard some noise. Okay, and I came out of my office. So 5 young government school students, they were wearing the blue uniform, Bangalore school uniform. They were navigating a robot into my room. They had come to show a robot which they had made. We were running a program called Just Robotics in some of the government schools. By the way, it has a lot of participation from the students on the front. Probably the most signed up class in the school was the Just Robotics class. So these 5 students, youngsters, they will be 12, 13 years of age. They were navigating a robot and they came to show me a robot. So they brought 2 robots. One was a color recognizing robot. Another was a traffic signal recognizing robot. Okay? And they had built this from scratch. When I say scratch, they had built it from scrap, not scratch. They had built it from scrap.
Wow.
Okay. And they were so happy to show that to me. And I could see how good food and coupled with good education, how it can transform lives of so many children.
Right.
So when you see children are our future, Roshan. So when you are able to give them good food by which they're able to come to school, food becomes an incentive, and good meal becomes an incentive for the children to come to school, and they get good education. Within one generation, they can break this cycle of poverty and hunger. Within one generation, they can pull out their family from the vicious cycle of poverty and hunger. I think that is what personally inspires me. And I'm sure that is what inspires all my team members. Like this, there are thousands of case studies, children becoming MD in obstetrics, MDS, Master in Dental Surgery, engineers, doctors, chartered accountants. And these are children who come from humble families. So they have been given wings to their dreams by good food and good education. And I think our Indian children, like any other children, are amazing, actually.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this compilation. Of course, there were many more moments from 2021 that we would have wished to highlight, but for the paucity of time. We have some amazing content planned for this year as well. And from the team at Bharatvaarta, I really thank you for all of the love and support. We look forward to another wonderful year ahead. Thank you. Stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.